twice hold referendums on leaving Canada, with these two referendums considered two of the most important moments in 20th century Canadian history. In 1976, the Quebecers elected an openly separatist government for the first time, and the guy who became Prime Minister of this government, René Lévesque, promised to hold a public vote on whether or not Quebec should remain part of Canada. Lévesque had only won a plurality of the popular vote, however, and Quebec public opinion was mostly pretty apprehensive about separatism, which in those days was still a pretty new and radical idea. Accordingly, the question that Lévesque ultimately put to voters in 1980 was quite moderate and defensive.
The government of Quebec has made public its proposal to negotiate a new agreement with the rest of Canada, based on the equality of nations. This agreement would enable Quebec to acquire the exclusive power to make its laws, levy its taxes, and establish relations abroad. In other words, sovereignty, and at the same time, to maintain with Canada an economic association, including a common currency. No change in political status resulting from these negotiations will be effected without approval by the people through another referendum. On these terms, do you give the government of Quebec the mandate to negotiate a proposed agreement between Quebec and Canada?
And even with all of those assurances that this vote wasn't going to be the final word, the referendum still failed by a pretty wide margin, with nearly 60% opposed. Now, the politics of the next 15 years were quite complicated, but basically during the 80s and early 90s, there were a lot of high-profile negotiations between the Quebec and Canadian governments under multiple different administrations about reforming the Canadian Constitution in ways that would be more to Quebec's liking. But they were unable to come up with mutually agreeable reforms, and this increased Quebec animosity towards the federal government quite a bit. During this same period, Quebec's non-French population also declined quite a bit through out-migration, which was in turn driven by the fact that laws emphasizing the supremacy of the French language and French culture in Quebec were becoming stricter. And the net consequence of all of this was that Quebec voters grew increasingly nationalistic during the 90s. A new separatist government was elected by a wider margin in 1994 under Monsieur Parizeau, and the following year he held a referendum asking a much simpler question.
Do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign after having formally offered Canada a new economic and political partnership under the bill respecting the future of Quebec and the agreement signed on June 12, 1995?
That last line was just a reference to a promise that the Parizeau administration had made that his new independent Quebec government would quickly sign some sort of treaty with Canada to resolve all outstanding issues relating to trade and commerce and borders, which may be giving some of my British friends flashbacks. But anyway, in a reflection of just how much Quebec had changed since 1980, the 1995 referendum only failed by the narrowest of margins, making it this very dramatic, emotional thing for people on all sides. The night Canada held its breath and all of that. But what's interesting is despite the closeness of the 95 vote, its outcome has been more or less respected as the final word on the separatist question for close to 30 years now. And the idea of holding a third separation referendum remains quite taboo even among separatist politicians. Okay, question number 2. What are some of the distinguishing features of Canadian literature? So, these days, I would say that Canadian literature, which is to say the books and novels being churned out by Canadian writers, is kind of all over the place and escapes easy characterization. During the 20th century, things were a bit different, with a lot of iconic novels being written about relatively consistent themes of Canadian history, rural Canadian life, and the Canadian immigrant experience. But in this century, I think that Canadian literature has followed the broader trend of the Western world, in which writers are eager to transcend narrowly predictable national themes and instead explore writing about anything and everything. When you look at the sort of Canadian fiction getting nominated for the big literary awards in recent years, you tend to see stories involving all sorts of different types of characters and settings and time periods and writing styles. A lot of award-winning Canadian novels don't even take place in Canada anymore. There was quite an acclaimed Canadian novel from a few years back that was based on a true story about American missionaries in Ecuador, for instance. I think who is doing the writing is something that tends to get more attention nowadays, with writers of color, and especially women writers of color, and people from indigenous indigenous Canadian backgrounds becoming a lot more prominent. This, too, I think mimics a broader trend in the Anglo world, where readers and publishers have growing interest in hearing stories from perspectives that have not been historically heard. There is a stereotype that Canadian literature tends to be a pretty downer genre overall. You know, lots of stories about people being trapped in very bleak, miserable lives and stuff. And I suppose it is true that if you look over some of the recent award winners, stories of sexism and institutionalized racism and social prejudice do seem to be quite popular themes. But I guess that is also understandable when we consider who is doing the writing. Number 3, how does a federal election get called in Canada? Well, it's not too complicated. The Prime Minister picks a date. The only constitutional restriction is that it cannot be more than 5 years after the last one. In theory, there is a law on the books saying that Canadian elections are supposed to occur on the third Monday of October every 4 years. But this law is also pretty constitutionally dubious, and prime ministers often violate it and just pick a date more to their liking. A vote of no confidence in the Canadian Parliament can also force the prime minister to call a snap election, but this only happens when the prime minister does not control a majority of the seats in the parliament, which is actually the situation that Prime Minister Trudeau is in right now, which means that the date of Canada's next election is theoretically even more uncertain than usual. Number 4, why does Vancouver have such a large Chinese population? I don't think that this is a particularly great mystery. If we look at the map, we can see that Vancouver is located relatively close to China, so it makes sense that a lot of immigrants from there would wind up here. This is the case all across the west coast of this continent, in fact, even down into Mexico and Latin and South America. Generally speaking, cities with large Chinese populations tend to correlate with being close to the Pacific Ocean. Question number 5. What is the significance of the Hudson's Bay Company? Okay, so this is a pretty big topic. The Hudson's Bay Company was a British fur trading corporation founded in the year 1670, and for the next 200 years or so, it became one of the most powerful players in the colonization of North America. Even though we usually think of Canada's colonial history as being defined by British rule, in practice, it was actually the Hudson's Bay Company that controlled most of the Canadian landmass in a day-to-day capacity. This particular style of imperial rule, outsourcing the management of a colony to a private corporation, was a relatively common practice among Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially in British India and Dutch Indonesia. Like I said, the HBC was in the business of furs, and they employed a vast army of animal hunters, many of them French-Canadian or native, with the company's forts initially centered around this area, known as Hudson's Bay. As demand for fur clothing in Europe grew, in the late 1700s, HBC fur traders moved deeper and deeper inland, setting up forts in modern-day Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. And eventually, the HBC laid claim to this whole giant mass of land, over 3 million square miles. But then, in the mid-19th century, British colonial policy shifted and began to favor the idea of filling up North America with white settlers. Power was accordingly stripped away from the HBC, who were obviously more inclined to keep the continent a big untamed wilderness filled with wild animals and not people. In 1870, under pressure from Britain, the HBC sold the majority of its vast land holdings to the new Canadian colonial government, and thereby more or less establishing Canada's modern borders. In the ensuing decades, the HBC then became basically a multi-purpose holding company, dabbling in a bunch of different industries, including real estate, oil development, and, as most Canadians will be most familiar with today, department stores. On May 2nd, 1970, the HBC's 300th birthday, it officially became a purely Canadian company specializing in retail, with its headquarters transferred from London to Winnipeg. Now, because of all of this history, the HBC, or the Bay, as most call it today, is a very sentimentalized symbol of Canadian history. And if you visit one of their modern stores, you can buy all of these souvenirs and things. But in these more sensitive times, I think it is also increasingly conceded that a lot of that history is also very much bound up in the displacement and exploitation of the native peoples of this continent. HBC fur traders get particular blame for spreading